Thank you for joining us for basic Buddhist teachings this evening. Last week, I spent some time talking about the life of the Buddha, and in a sense, the example it sets for the path for the rest of us, not just as pseudo-historical, or perhaps fully mythological story we don't really know, but the model it sets for our transition or incorporation into the spiritual path from a path of trying to modify senses, acquire particular sensations, and navigate our life basically by trying to create relative comfort, and how through our dissatisfaction or to some extent recognition that no matter how fine our experiences, it can't be maintained, we feel inspired to begin approaching the spiritual path. And the last thing we talked about was the final gesture the Buddha made under the Bodhi tree, where he reached down and placed his hand on the earth or in the earth, using that as the gesture of his realization. And this week, I wasn't sure what I was going to talk about, so I thought I would rehash last week and see if anything came out of that. And so Chiezan and I had talked briefly before coming in, and sometimes he has a very crisp topic. He says, I'd like you to talk about this. And this week, our crispness was in the ambiguity. There wasn't anything showing up strongly. So I thought I would talk a little bit about meditation practice and this idea of setting up standards. That this idea of no standard or no reference point is a foundational aspect of Buddhism. That the Buddha's story, if we come back to that life story, was a story of not setting up standards. That doesn't mean he didn't explore the standard thoroughly. So the first standard he explored was sensory pleasure in the past. And the next standard he explored was traditional spiritual meditative practices. And then finally, he explored the standard of strict asceticism or self-deprecation or self-mortification. And it was this middle way he discovered, sitting down, taking the food he needed, having somewhat of a comfortable seat, and just an insistence to see the truth. And this teaching shows up throughout all of Buddhism, as far as I can tell. Some of the ways we're familiar hearing this would be the most explicit: don't set up standards of your own. The walls of the mind that are talked about in the Heart Sutra. The Sin Ming says picking and choosing is the disease of the mind. Another one would be, if you wish to know the way, don't seek the truth, only cease to cherish opinions. So all of these are pointing at some form of standard that we set up that, in a sense, obscures or limits our relationship to the world. It's very tempting to go into the way in which the rest of the world is exhibiting these reference points or these standards. And sometimes it's a little disappointing, although maybe it's helpful that we love to talk about world politics. We love to talk about family politics. We love to talk about relational politics. So Kazan's talked about the politics of experience. So it's so easy what everyone else is doing. How can we do it if they're doing this? This insanity, this insanity, this insanity. But just in entering this room, we ourselves may not be aware of the standards we are stepping into. Joining Zoom, the standard we come to this practice with. And to be clear, the standard is not a problem. The standard is very natural. The standard is part of dependent origination. It's part of the inertia of being a human being. But it's when our world fails to meet our expectations, and in the midst of that conflict, that suffering gets really intense, because we start to make demands. And I think the Dharma is our opportunity to practice very, very strong standards without grasping at standards. So let's talk about meditation practice and the way in which we hold on to standards. As I understand the practice of Zazen, Shikantaza, Sokuzan has taught it, as our lineage has taught it in both the Kagyu tradition, through Mahamudra, as well as through the Zen lineage of formless meditation. It is such a simple practice because of its lack of standards, because of its lack of reference points. But through the conditioning of careers and family and lifetimes, we almost require a standard to reassure ourselves. So meditation practice, it's part of when you sit down to meditate, and all of our questions seem to come up about navigating the phenomena, that we still get caught up on the content of our mind and the content of our experience. And we forget that very key instruction. It's always about awareness. It's always about awareness. I think somebody during As It Is asked about, I think it was Robin asked about unexamined negativity. And the way that shows up to me is that you could examine unexamined negativity without the negativity ever arising. If it requires the negativity to arise, there's still some sense that there's a conclusion that can be made. There's some way of parsing out the negativity so it's so clear that we have gone beyond it. But the way in which we examine our negativity every day, regardless of what emotions arise, is just the prioritization of the awareness itself. Just the intention to receive, the intention to observe, so that that crispness doesn't need a particular form of content to arise. It just shines a light on whatever shows up, whatever arises. And it's perhaps why it's so important that we persist in the meditation practice. So much so that we begin to wear out this impulse to come to a conclusion. We begin to see the way in which every time we sit down, there's some aspect of a standard based on how we feel, the type of thoughts that arise. Are we getting anywhere? Am I feeling better? And following Unyo's example, recently been reading Shunryu Suzuki's biography, and not dissimilar to Dogen. He very much, as most traditional Soto priests are, very tied into Dogen as kind of the archetype of the lineage and archetype of how to practice. But he kind of comes back to that idea of just sitting is realization, that you don't actually practice Zazen, you just sit Zazen. You don't actually practice meditation, you just sit meditation. And perhaps we're getting into semantics because we do practice meditation. We talk about practicing meditation, but it's not practice in the traditional sense of progressing. You're really sitting down in a complete form the very first time you take the posture, the very first time you receive the instruction and you come to the cushion with the intention. It is a complete practice from day one. It's like we may have to spend 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years to realize that the first time we sat down, we were looking at it. But it's not a practice of living up to a standard. And so that's something I think that is helpful to look at. It can also alleviate some of the pressure we put on ourselves through practice. Just the generosity of making it to the cushion, the generosity of having an intention to be sincere without validating how we feel. The sincerity of the openness, the sincerity of the vulnerability to be in the midst of however the mind and the senses are arising. Pause has gone on too long. I'm not sure where to go to next. When you
When you're bowing, is awareness a standard bowing?
It is so long as we create it as a standard in our mind. And I think that awareness to me lacks, in some sense, the type of tangibility other things do. But if we think awareness is conceptual registering, like that if we're very, very aware conceptually, we will be registering all 6 sense fields nonstop. I don't think that's awareness. I think that's thinking process. I think that's the sixth consciousness. And the closest I can come to understanding awareness itself is coming back to that idea of not knowing, of a lack of standard, because there's really no direction to go with anything except for the direction that things take naturally.
When you're bowing, I think you said that we don't have anything to live up to as in Chikantaza, as a standard. So how is a standard different from a form bowing?
I think that in a sense, it has to do with the relationship, because they could be the same thing. That standards, as I've said, are a necessary aspect of the path. There has to be some guidelines, some sort of container in which to function in. It's just when those guidelines become defenses and barriers and walls of the mind, meaning that we feel that they are in and of itself the truth, that if we can just maintain these standards, then we have a strong structure for practice. Forms have the same potential, that the forms, and again, to define that, meaning for me, the containers we use for practice, the form of bowing, the form of meditating, the form of Dharma talks, the form of book study, that those similarly can have complete permeability, or they can turn into sectarianism, or they can become dogmatism, they become solidified because of our fear. We need some sort of reference point, so we use the practice forms as ways of promoting and defending. So I think both of them have the potential to be supportive in as far as we don't lock down on them, or they can also become barriers in as far as we cling to them as the truth itself.
When you're bowing, I want to bring up an example that happened several months ago when you were giving a talk on kindness, I believe.
Yes.
And we had two visitors that day, sitting right here in the front row, a woman and her young son, maybe
Yes.
10-year-old. And she spent a lot of time on her phone while you were giving the talk. And the son was lying down.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a certain form or standard here, but no one corrected either of them. So is that too loose of a form then?
No, and I don't say this to excuse anything, but you can't argue with the completely appropriate expression that occurred. It's not to say that we don't come back and talk about how, if that happens again, let's say something. But to go to war, to go back into that and try to modify it to create a better result or a better outcome, or to critique or criticize, it has a type of disrespect for the natural causes and conditions that came together. And we did talk about it, and we did say, like, if that happens again, I have a responsibility sitting up here to say something, or any one of the monks could have said something. But to go at it with kind of like that punitive mindset, it doesn't work, because if it should have happened differently, it would have. And that again has nothing to do with the relativity or the functionality. that had somebody done something, things would have functioned in a more smooth way. But you could also look at it as a gesture of generosity, because had that not happened, the part of our minds that was triggered, whether that was triggered through how cute or how disrespectful, or some of you may not even remember that aspect of the mind couldn't have been examined. So we could look at the chaos as a gesture of generosity. And that doesn't mean we become complacent in the chaos, that we are submissive to the chaos, but that it is providing an opportunity that while we may need to respond relatively, the very thing that gets triggered is our Buddha nature, you could say. It's the very thing that we may need to look at most closely.
When you're bowing, I don't know if you can answer this or not, but you were giving a talk on kindness, and the woman sat right in front of you. Was there any consideration on your part to not call her out because you were giving a talk on kindness, bowing?
There wasn't in, if there was, it would have been a misunderstanding of what kindness is. Again, kindness is not necessarily indulging whatever shows up in front of you. So there was not any thought of like, oh, I'm talking about kindness and it would be unkind for me to say something. It really was, it might have been the first Wednesday talk Chiezan had me give. And so while I'd given some of those before, it was a bit new. And really, I think it's just somewhat of learning how to relate to that. So it was not meditated or strategized, other than I, looking back, probably just didn't know what to do. And so I just kept going. And it was apparent how much that was interplaying with me, my communication. So,
Bowing, you brought up, I can't remember if it's Sandokai or if it was online, but one of the translation, the version of don't set up standards of your own, that last kind of qualifying part seems important. What's important about the standards of our own bowing?
just that they tend to indulge existing thought patterns. And I've talked about this before, at least my experience before having a teacher was very much about accumulating spirituality in as far as it fit within my existing ideas and beliefs. So very much attached to the very idealistic aspects of each religion and the different quotes and the different speakers that said things that I thought were very altruistic, but I never was willing to go into or receive the parts that would challenge me. So when we set up standards of our own, the tendency is to do so in such a way that it protects the identity, as opposed to taking us deeper into what that is.
With that idea of going deeper into what this is there some need to feel crappy or to go into stuff that doesn't feel good?
Not necessarily. Again, without setting up standards, it's probably unlikely that you can get into a practice like meditation and not have aspects of negativity arising. But there's just no way to set that up and say, yes, everyone has to do this. But probably unlikely that you're going to get out of this unscathed.
Bowing, you've used the word crispness a couple of times. What are you pointing at there? Bowing.
Can you tell me how I use them? And it's okay if you don't. And I hate that question because it's like challenging, as if I didn't say that. I'm sure I did. I can think of one where I said there was crispness in the ambiguity between Chiezan and I in the Hojo. And I was probably just saying something stupid. There was no need to resolve not knowing what to talk about. That's what I noticed. He was not coming with any sort of energy, like, yes, we need to find something out and you need to talk about this topic. And I also didn't feel any particular aggression towards like, I need to have something to talk about. So there was just, there was no urgency. That was the type of crispness in that situation. I'm not sure where else I used it.
Well, Devon, it seems like very similar to the appropriateness, appropriate of whatever shows up. So you looked at the question, what should you talk about? And didn't insist on a result.
You can't do appropriateness the way it looks to me, because if you do, then everything's not appropriate. It's just when you do appropriateness, it's appropriate. It's completely out of our hands, the appropriateness of dependent origination. I really feel like, I don't know why, but that word inertia is really strong for me. We have a bunch of little kids hanging out right now. I've got my 2.5-year-old nephew, and then there's Maya, who's about 1.5 years, and Alaya, who's going to be 2 soon. And all of us were in for Jizo Durrani, and it was kind of neat. You have 3 children, all within 1 year of one another. And if we want to talk about inertia, how at such a young age, there's such a vast difference. So the appropriateness is seeing that there's nothing to do and there's nothing not to do. It's not inactivity, but it's not an expression of proper activity. It is being willing to witness causes and conditions as they arise and fall. And I think that's why Dogen says, you know, practice enlightenment, that this is practice enlightenment, because there's nothing lacking when you take the posture. You could say there's nothing lacking when you're eating a sandwich or when you're driving, but we use the example of seated meditation. I don't know if I've gone off of what you were asking about.
Well, Devon, I think I've gone off on what I was asking about as well. And when you use that word inertia, that made me think of what is happening when we're daily interacting with our teacher. Is there some benefit to that? Is there inertia building because of that daily interaction, daily teaching, that daily presence?
I don't know that I know how to respond to that. And I think the reason being is that there's no way for me to talk about that in a way that would blanket all the students of Sokuzans. And there would be no way for me to really parse out how those causes and conditions come together. To some extent, that's a relief on the path, because we're not asked to crisply see every cause and condition and understand it so that we can see how the path is unfolding and will come to fruition. I think Trungpa Rinpoche talked a lot about orderly chaos. And to me, that phrase orderly chaos applies in this situation that you're bringing up. The orderly part of it, Trungpa Rinpoche talks about the orderly part being the discipline. The orderly part is the returning. The orderly part is meditating. The orderly part is having forms. But the chaos is all of the movement and all of the sense fields, which you really can't see a source or direction for. You may see a momentary direction. You see a momentary direction of like somebody knocking a cup off of a table, but it makes it appear linear when those causes and conditions are coming from all directions and going in all directions. So I think that's just a simple or a complicated way of saying I don't know. I think if I were to say anything, when Sokuzan asked me over my time studying with him, what's been the most important, and I can say without hesitation, it's meditating. It provides a non-conceptual framework in which to be with what arises. And it seems without that practice of formlessness, the first relative form of formlessness, meditation, we would take everything that's happening here and try to piece it together like a puzzle, but meditation keeps taking us back to square one.
Thank you. I think, I need to think about this.
Okay.
Um,
And I quote Sokuzan, don't think too hard, what he said to me before. Shanjian.
Chiezan, when I'm sitting and you talk about formlessness, it feels like I bring standards into it by giving myself instructions when I'm sitting, just receive something like that. Is that too much?
I don't think so. And not setting up standards, as I said, is not an absence of standards, because if you look at that and say, well, that's too much, whatever you replace that with is the same form of confusion, just it looks different. So whatever's showing up, that comes back to that the content is not what we need to manage in meditation practice. There's nothing to manage, but to begin to recognize the content of the mind or the content of the senses isn't indicating something. That's not what our instruction is on the cushion. And even though it's not our instruction, it also doesn't mean that that content needs to do anything differently. It may really ramp up. But I think there's something very powerful about just the physical form of meditation. Just that physical form of lack of entertainment. That's really powerful. And so whatever pep talks you're giving yourself, in as far as you can, just look at them and notice if it wants to take you to the left or to the right or up or down. And if you spontaneously go in one of those directions, just notice it from there.
Chiezan, so it seems like those instructions could also be used to cover up what's going on in the meditation as well. I don't know what my question is, but I guess I'm wondering if there can be some manipulation there just by using those standards.
Yes. Yes, there can be, and that's where we come into the relationship with the teacher. You bring that to the teacher and they can respond or interact with that. All, in a sense, all of it's manipulation. It's like there's nothing happening that's not manipulation, because we are grasping, rejecting, and looking away. There's always manipulation happening. So we're not looking to be devoid of manipulation. Like the basic teaching the Buddha, I think, put forward was that everything is without self-nature. If everything is without self-nature, then everything's appropriate, because there's nothing to do. There's nothing to modify. So the manipulation is without self-nature. So what difference does it make if the manipulation arises or falls, becomes more intense or softens? So we want to look very closely at it in the form that it's arising. And also not to forget to look at or consider or flash on what it is that believes it's observing. Because we can also really build up a credential of being a powerful observer, a powerful meditator. There's something strengthening its observation of something else. So all of it comes into question. All of it comes into our awareness, which I don't know that we can find the awareness itself. Thank you. Any other questions this evening?
Wonderful. How does the teacher show us our minds?
In a sense, in the same way everything shows us our mind, but we take a different attitude initially. So it's the relative way in which we empower the situation, I think that begins to allow us to consider the way in which everything is our responsibility. So the teacher, I think, focuses or brings our attention down to a crisp point, a very fine, a very defined structure, a defined relationship that has a lot of room. But as I've said before, it feels like it's the starting point for the rest of the world, that there's nothing expressing something that everything else is not also expressing. If it is, we start to get back into that sacred and profane, that evil and holy mentality. But we do have to have some sort of way to begin the path. And I think that in bringing it down to a point with the teacher, with the practice, with a lineage, it helps us begin to cut through some of the idealism. Because when we devote ourselves to a practice, when we devote ourselves to a religion, to a lineage, to a teacher, we do so with an attitude that we're going to relate to it as it shows up. Whereas if we become too broad too quickly, we get back into that idealization of everything is my teacher, everything is preaching the Dharma, which may be true, but if we can't see it in one point, then we're not going to be able to see it in all points. I think sometimes this is talked about with like the Diamond Sutra, to understand just one couplet from the Diamond Sutra. It's like it unlocks all of the Buddhist teachings, because it's all being said in every single word. So just see it in that one word, in that one person, in that one practice, in that one situation. It's a really pretty bad example. Somebody once told me that the way they train people to see counterfeit money is to study really real money, like to just know the real thing so intimately and intensely that you never have to look at anything else. You can just see everything else is not that one thing. It's a really bad example. It's a baseball coach that told me that when I was like 10th grade. He was trying to convert me to, well, he's trying to bring me back into Christianity. Like, don't look at other religions, just know Christ. And backfired. His name was Coach Ely. Doubt he's watching. Okay.
Milka bowing. We were talking about the starting point, and I was wondering what is the starting point of that the Buddha taught?
I think the most traditional one we know about it would be, is it Vulture Peak that he gave a sermon about the Four Noble Truths? Vulture Peak, or Sarnath. Yeah. Anyway, that to me, that was the starting point to basically describe the human condition that the path was going to address. So the first noble truth describes the human condition, suffering. The second noble truth describes how we get to that situation. The third noble truth gives us a little inspiration of that could come to an end. And the fourth noble truth says, here's the path to do it. So I would say the starting point, and as far as we know, and I would say beyond that, maybe each one of us could reflect on our own starting point, probably had some connection to suffering itself, the dissatisfaction of the phenomenal world.
Milka bowing. What is it about the dissatisfaction that helps us look at the truth?
Well, it's dissatisfying. So I think there's a tremendous amount of energy because of the tension it creates. That desire, that impulse, that conditioning to no happiness or no peace. And I don't think any of us start the path out without some idealism of what liberation is going to be like, of taking off the baggage of decades or lifetimes of negativity, and that understanding may become more refined over time. But I also look at, maybe this isn't a conceptual way, but for some of us, we sit more than ever when we're having a hard time. There's something about sitting that almost becomes easier when we're suffering. It's like, I'm gonna do a double block sit today. I'm gonna sit for 8 hours today. I'm gonna sit for 10 hours today. So I think suffering is a pretty powerful motivator. And I think the motivation to sit comes from exhausting the other avenues. We feel drawn back to meditating because we know that beer or that pint of ice cream or that partner is not actually going to address the fundamental discomfort we're having. Michelle?
Michelle, where's the happiness within that suffering?
I would say first, there's the relative happiness, which we can still appreciate. I think that's sometimes okay to acknowledge that we can enjoy going to a movie. We can enjoy having a cup of coffee or having a cheeseburger or whatever it is you like, going skydiving. You like movies, I like movies. There's some happiness there. We know it's not going to last. We know it's not the substitute. We know it's not the remedy or the antidote. And the only other way I could talk about this is, beginning to look at happiness as not a sensation. And for me, I resonate with the words ease or rest. And I don't know why. I know that doesn't work for everybody. So I'm not saying this is something to look for, but when I sit down to meditate, there's some sort of relief. There's some sort of taking my seat. There's some sort of coming to the cushion that is supported by knowing, by seeing that you have no obligation to manipulate anything. Now we first have to look at the impulse to manipulate the mind stream to be more meditative. But there is something that is comforting or supportive, knowing that as I think Sokuzan said, everything that arises has a right to be there. Just that intimate sovereignty of everything that's showing up moment by moment. It's not the happiness of like joy or jubilation, but there's something about that feels supportive. Thank you. Is there a final question this evening? Shoto.
Shoto bowing, does that rest or ease show up outside of the forms? Bowing?
I think it can. But again, even what I'm describing, the fact that if it shows up and goes away, it's still an aspect of the path. It's not fundamental, it's not foundational, if it's still arising and falling. But I think we may have glimpses of that kind of softness where we see that it's not necessary to go to war with what is arising, and it's not a detached or artificial objectivity. It's not a concept, it's just a willingness to relate to the situation as it is, without demands. Without demands in the midst of the demands. You can dedicate the mirror.
Make America penetrate into all places so that we and every sentient being together can realize the Buddha's name. Jiro San Chi Chi Song San San The 10 directions of the 3 times, all Buddhas, all venerable ones, Bodhisattvas, Mahasattvas, the great Prajna, Paramita.
O Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the 10 directions and the 3 times, please hear us. Please come down out of the light and protect Sokokoji Buddhist Temple Monastery, our Sangha, families, friends, and visitors. Heal everyone who is unhappy, sick, or suffering, and fill them with light.